Okay, so yeah, I'll just briefly introduce our guest speakers today. So we have Dr. James Mickley, who's a herbarium creator at the Oregon State University. We have Dr. Timothy Moore, who is the Director of Statistical Consulting Services at the University of Connecticut. Both Dr. Mickley and Dr. Moore were both former PhD students in the same lab in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut. And today they'll be discussing measuring the microenvironment using do-it-yourself environmental microcontroller units, or EMUs, which are essentially data loggers designed to be easily built and accurately measure variation at fine spatial and temporal scales at low cost. So yeah, please take it away.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, this is Tim speaking. You'll be able to tell us, James and I, apart because I'm the one with the strange South African accent. James will be the American one. Kind of as Simon mentioned, this is really work that came out of the time when both James and I were working on our PhDs, but really had nothing to do with the PhD work that either of us were doing. It was something that kind of started off as a side project and quickly ballooned into something much, much larger than that, especially once we realized the sort of scale and the scope of what we were working on, the potential applications that they were for this type of thing, hence why we're here to talk to you about this today. So for us, we were primarily focused on the ecological applications of DIY environmental sensor units. But as we'll discuss and as we talk through this, hopefully you'll see that there are many more applications beyond this. And what we try to do in this talk is going to highlight some of the challenges that we face and also have some discussion points at the end about dealing with some of those data challenges, and not just in collection, but actually sort of measuring them and measuring things like environment and how we actually do that. Let's see, make sure I can switch slides. Okay, great. So nowhere on Earth is going to be safe from the effects of climate change. So as ecologists, we're interested in how natural systems are going to respond to these changes in environmental conditions. This is especially interesting for plant ecologists because individual plants can't move to track favorable environmental conditions. So how are these sort of changes that we're expecting to see of temperature and the distribution of precipitation going to affect natural systems? And so to really start answering this question, we need climate and environmental data at spatial and temporal scales that are relevant to the organisms that we want to study. So currently, climate data that's most widely used, especially in ecological circles, looks a little bit something like this. So this is a map of mean annual temperature from the WorldClim data set. And so when you look at it at this scale, at this sort of resolution, you can see it looks like a very nice smooth map where, you know, across the Earth, we have a good idea of what temperature is at any one point on the Earth's surface. But when we actually look at what's underlying that map, that very nice smooth looking map, is actually those maps are being based on individual weather station data. And these weather stations, which in this map that I'm showing right now, you can see each red dot represents a weather station that's used to generate the WorldClim data. And you can see that these weather stations themselves are unevenly distributed around the world. There's some places that have an awful lot. There's some places that are not doing so well. At this scale, it certainly looks like the US is doing quite well, but then you look at somewhere like the Amazon, which is a real hotbed for plant diversity and animal diversity, right? You know, a really important place ecologically, and there are not very many weather stations there. And so these global models are used to generate sort of these global temperature layers or precipitation layers or any sort of environmental layers. Often ignore the sort of really finer scale landscape level heterogeneity. And one of the key things is that these data are often derived from places, these weather stations are often in places that are not representative of the environmental conditions even around them. So a great example of this is very often weather stations, even in Connecticut, are found at airports where they're located close to the runway in completely cleared areas. So for example, and here you can see also as we zoom in, I just wanted to mention, as we zoom in, you can see that actually the coverage in Connecticut even is not necessarily all that great. There's quite a lot of area here where we don't necessarily have good representation in terms of weather stations close by. And so a fundamental question is how representative of the conditions, say for example, if we were to plop down a grid square, how representative of environmental conditions for this entire grid cell are the conditions that we derive from this one weather station, which is likely located at an airport. So James and I looked at this and we thought that there must be some better way to capture environmental variation at finer spatial scales. This becomes even more interesting and important perhaps when you look at more heterogeneous environments. So this photograph, I had to put a plug in for South Africa into my talk, so here it is. So this is a picture showing some mountains just outside of Cape Town. And you can imagine that there's a lot of going to be a lot of environmental heterogeneity, a lot of that driven by topographic variation here, but also related to slope and aspects of the direction that these hillsides are facing. And so these kinds of micro-environmental features may have a huge impact on the future distributions of plants, or how we might understand how plants or animals might move and respond to future environmental change. So the challenge here is that we need fine-scale spatial and temporal environmental data that are at scales relevant to the organisms that we want to study, or the organisms that we're interested in. But they also need to be broad, and also needs to be broad enough for us to understand or make interpretations at global levels, because that's the level at which we're interested. The problem that we face though is that sensors and sensor units themselves are really expensive. And so what James, myself, and a few undergrads that we had working for us at the time set out to do was examine the potential uses of DIY microcontrollers and potential uses of as means of measuring environmental data at fine spatial and temporal scales at low cost. So I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to talk a little bit about the rise of the EMUs, as we called them, or EMUs, as Simon mentioned.
Tim, I believe you have to unshare.
There we go.
There we go. All right, so as Tim mentioned, we kind of looked around and looked at what the options were for measuring microenvironment with commercial off-the-shelf sensors. And I'm just going to give like a quick overview of what's out there. So the first are kind of like the relatively inexpensive ones, but they're also quite limited. And so one area that they're limited in is that if you want to measure temperature, you're great, but beyond temperature and maybe humidity, there aren't a lot of options. And so we know that a lot of other variables are important as well. They don't tend to store that much data. And so you only have a couple thousand readings that you can store on this thing. And there's no connectivity. So that data has to be retrieved from the field or wherever this logging sensor is. And in many cases, they don't even have a replaceable battery. So they're single-use devices that last a couple of years and then that's it. So obviously not ideal. And even for what you're getting there, they're still not terribly cheap. So if you're buying one of these for $50 and you want to get 1,000 of them, that will be a large expense. And so that's a bit of an issue if you want to have broad spatial scales, but also fine sampling. So there's a step up from these. These are sort of the Cadillacs. And I have two here from Hobo, but there's some other makers that make stuff like this as well. And so these are more of like a modular thing where it's an enclosed box and you have various sensors that can be hooked up to this and in different combinations as well. So they're more flexible with regards to sensors. They also tend to have much better battery support, so replaceable batteries and longer battery life. And they store a lot more data, so you don't have to go back and retrieve them as much. And in some cases, the real best of the best have some sort of connectivity. So either Wi-Fi or perhaps Bluetooth or cell connectivity. So they can actually send their data live to the web, which is great. but they really cost a lot. So something like that that does all of those things is running $1,500. And so if you want to do fine scale sampling, you're really limited by that cost. And so our solution was to make our own. And we realized that you can buy these sort of off the shelf little microcontroller computers and hook up some sensors to them. And that could be quite cheap and still collect the same types of data. And so our EMUs compare to these Cadillacs, where they can store quite a lot of data, measure quite a lot of things. And they're also modular, so we can sort of mix and match sensors. And they've got, AA batteries, something that's easy to replace. And they have Wi-Fi as well. And all of this for under $20. So the cost is a really nice aspect of this. And the reason that this is possible really goes back to the Arduino. So this was invented in 2005 as sort of like a little computer that students could work with that would be relatively inexpensive. And the Arduino sort of brought in a couple key innovations that have really made hobbyist electronics a lot easier. So the first thing is it's really plug and play. So these Arduinos have these little pins and places where you can just kind of plug in wires, or you can plug the whole thing into a breadboard. And that lets you very easily kind of prototype stuff without having to solder things or get stuff built and so on and so forth. Another innovation that was really nice is that a community kind of developed around these things. And so there was software libraries for all kinds of different sensors and the like that are already built for you. And you can just sort of throw them into code and start working with them. They're USB, so you can plug them into a computer quite easily to program them. And they also can get power through USB. And they're really quite cheap. So a lot of this especially is because of China. China jumped on this and has done a really excellent job of making both Arduinos and similar things, and also the modules, the things with sensors on them that we use to work with them. And they can be in the range of a couple of dollars. And so just to give you a comparison of different microcontrollers that have happened since the Arduino got smaller. So we've got this Arduino Nano that's only about 4 centimeters long. And it's not a particularly powerful computer by any means of the imagination. So we only have about 2 kilobytes of RAM. So it requires a lot of careful programming to not waste such resources. But since then, a company called Expressive in China has started making microcontrollers, and they made the ESP8266 and the ESP32 that were much, much more powerful than Arduinos, but also still quite cheap. So in the $4 to $10 range. And they also have more flexibility in terms of how they're programmed. So we can program these in C++ like an Arduino with the same libraries as an Arduino, but we can also program them with Lua and Python, where we actually have like a command prompt that we can type code in interactively as well. And they have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, which lets you do a lot more things. And then on the very sort of far right here is the Raspberry Pi, which I would consider the Cadillac of these types of things, but it's still only $35. And that is really a full-on computer. So you can run Linux on this. Some people even use it as their desktop computer. And so we chose to focus on this ESP8266 because it was still quite cheap. And at the time that we started developing this, the ESP32 wasn't out yet. And so that's what we're using, and it's been quite a nice little computer for us. So we built a lot of these with our group of undergrads, and we just sort of put these things out in the woods and started logging data. And I think now we've probably built over 200. Does that sound right, Tim? Yeah, so there were some growing pains with that process, and we'd be happy to sort of discuss that, but we've learned a lot on how to mass produce these things in sort of an assembly line fashion. And we wrote a paper on this, both our work in developing these as well as testing them. And so there's the paper link. And we have a nice little GitHub website where we just take you through everything that you need to do to build these things. So we've got a list of parts. We've got instructions for how to wire these things. We've got instructions for how to program these things, how to connect them to a computer and get the software on there. We've got all the software, instructions for downloading data once it's been logged to that if you're not using Wi-Fi. And we even made a little video of building this. And so that's a nice resource. And here I can show you, this is a breadboard on the left. And the way breadboards work is that all of the rows where it says row 1, that's all connected. And so when you plug 2 wires into that, you're basically making an interconnect. And so you can use that sort of sequence to just kind of make a little circuit. And then it's really nice and easy to copy because you can just say, well, put a wire from C2 to C11. And we can actually just write these things down for students to follow the prototype. But we also made a circuit board as well. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can show you this. So here's one of our circuit boards. And the benefit of these circuit boards is they're a little bit more durable, so you don't have to worry about wires pulling out. And it's designed to be modular, so it's not a circuit for any one configuration of a group of sensors. Like you could plug in a bunch of different sensors and a bunch of different combinations like this, and all the wiring is all set up for you. The reason that we haven't sort of made everything work with the circuit boards is that they don't tend to work as well with moisture resistance. These breadboards are much more resistant to slight amounts of moisture that can get inside our Tupperware containers that we use as enclosures. And so we haven't used them as much for that, but if you're using them indoors, these things are great. And I can actually show you how this works. So let's see, I'm gonna got this. And so here's my computer. This is my microcontroller, ESP8266. I can plug that in. And I've got a little screen here. So I'm going to plug the screen in. And this is our temperature, humidity, and moisture sensor. The actual sensor, hopefully you guys can see, is this tiny little silver thing. And then the board is one of these nice little modules that the Chinese produce and make it really easy to work with because they just plug in. And so that's my little microcontroller EMU. And so all I need to do now is give it some power. So I'm going to hook this up to a power bank, give it some power, and it should boot up and start logging. Well, maybe not. There we go. Put this in the wrong way. One of the many things that you learn that becomes an issue. So now it's actually logging data. Hope you guys can see it's backwards for me, but it's logging temperature and humidity. And if I put my finger over this, the temperature and humidity should go up. And I can even add a little red, green, blue LED as a status device. And so now it's blinking every time it logs. So I'll go back to sharing. Those are sort of the EMUs, and that's really how simple it's become to sort of build a little sensor system. Of course, you need to do the coding as well, but most of that's pretty easy as well. And now we're going to go back to Tim.
Make sure I unmute myself. Okay, so once we built these sort of sensor units, as James mentioned, we needed to find some way of testing them out. And one of the main things we decided to do was to sort of compare their accuracy and precision to some of those commercial sensors that, like we mentioned. So here's a photo which I'll come back to, but here you can see our sort of one of our example setups in the field. So really we had two main questions that we were interested in. Firstly, we wanted to check whether our sensor units, our cheap, $3 temperature sensor, does it actually compare to a commercially available sensor that could be orders of magnitude more expensive. And we also then wanted to check, which was sort of our fundamental kind of more ecological question, was are they capable of actually capturing fine scale spatial and temporal variation? And to do this, we designed a relatively simple field-based study. So as I mentioned, we really wanted to compare the accuracy of our BME 280, which is the sensor that James just demonstrated for you, this $3 sensor. Again, here you can actually see quite nicely in this image that the sensor itself is actually just this little square here. You can see it has a tiny little hole opening, which is what is allowing air into the sensor. We compared this to two other commercially available sensors, the sort of middle of the range Hobo Pendant, which is a $47 temperature sensor. And then also compared it to a Maxim eye button, which could measure both temperature and humidity. And I would say the Maxim eye buttons are incredibly popular and very widely used, at least in ecological circles for measuring temperature and humidity. So this was a great opportunity for us to do that comparison. And then, like I said, the second part of that question was, can our EMUs actually measure microenvironment? And to look at this very briefly, we looked at two transects. Our transects themselves were set about 80 meters apart. You can see that this aerial photo with the points here are showing the positions in which we put down our microcontroller units and the comparable commercial sensors. So this distance here is about 80 meters apart, transect to transect. The satellite image was clearly taken in winter, so there's no leaves on the trees, but actually over the time that we were measuring this, the differences between these sites probably became more and more stark as leaves started growing up on these trees. And so we compared these two sites, this forested site and this wet meadow site. Just as an anecdote, as with any fieldwork, there are always challenges that you don't expect. James and I eventually had to rip down a beaver dam to get to the site. You can see there's a swamp here, swamp labeled here. We had a beaver set up a dam on the sort of just off the edge of this map here. Made it really challenging to get to our site. We would just get soggy shoes every time we walked over this beaver dam until we got too fed up and ripped the dam down. I think it rebuilt it a couple times actually before we finished this field testing. And so what we did was we set our microcontrollers and the commercial sensors to measure every 15 minutes for 3 weeks. And this is one of the things that, the sort of unforeseen things that we had to learn to deal with this study was you generate a lot of data. It's very easy to generate a lot of data. And it's not necessarily very easy to sort of disentangle signal from noise with that data. So again, just going back to this image, this is what it looked like in the field. You can see here we have our Hobo Pendant unit. We tried to sort of make them as comparable as possible. So you can see we have these little solo cups that we're using as kind of solar shields. So we have our Hobo Pendant under a solar shield. Here down at the bottom of the screen, you can see our actual EMU microcontroller. There's the ESP, as like James showed you. This is the breadboard, like James mentioned, which we're using kind of as our circuit board. You'll also see that we have this this black box here is our four pack battery pack that we use to power this while it was in the field. So that's another really useful thing, is how incredibly efficient these are in terms of power usage. At the back here, you can see one of the other sensors that we use. This is the Hobo microstation that James showed you in his earlier on in the talk. And then this little R2D2 thing here is actually the light sensor that is attached to the Hobo microstation. Right over here, you can see we have the eye button, again, in a similar thing, sort of housed under a sensor hat, just like our sensors were. And then our EMU sensors with the light sensor on top, and then our temperature and humidity sensor would be on the other side of this cup. So one of the things we wanted to do is check our light sensor against an industry standard. So our light sensor costs about $1. The industry standard is a light core power meter, or photosynthetically active radiation meter, which costs about $1,000 for the sensor itself. So not just the logger, but it's actually for the sensor itself, I believe. And we wanted to be able to convert our sensor measurements, which were in lux, to measurements in PAR, this photosynthetically active radiation, which is a bit more meaningful for plant studies. And this in and of itself was not necessarily a trivial, this was in and of itself was non-trivial, because we had to be very careful about making sure that the angle at which we had both sensors was consistent and uniform, so that they were sort of both pointing more or less the same direction. We needed to also make sure that we were logging the light values at more or less, or at exactly the same time, or as close to simultaneously as possible. So you can see James here, this is James outside on the UConn campus with our contraption that we sort of developed so that we could try and get our measurements as precise as possible. And you can see that given all of those constraints and all those challenges, our $1 lux sensor with just a simple quadratic does a pretty good job of matching this $1,000 power sensor. So this was pretty encouraging for us, although again, like someone mentioned in a question, why are they charging $1,000 for something that a $1 sensor could do? And that is a really good question. So then in terms of, from the field experiments, like I said, we were interested in how our EMU sensors were comparing to commercial sensors. So one of the first things, so here in this plot, you can see we have EMU temperature on the y-axis, hobo temperature on the x-axis. And you can see, especially at low temperatures, there's pretty good agreement between our EMU sensor and our hobo pendant sensor at this point. What you can notice though is as the temperatures increase, you see there's an increase in the scatter of these points around this regression line. And one of the reasons that we believe that we see this is that what you can see is this hobo pendant is designed to be waterproof. And so the temperature sensor, the actual sensor itself that's measuring air temperature is encased in a sealed waterproof container. And so what might be happening is that the air inside that container could be heating up and then may take a while to cool. And so the hobo might tend to read hotter than the EMU over those times when it's in the sun, it heats up and then takes a little bit of time to cool. So we also then took a look at our EMU temperature versus eye button temperature. And here you can see the fit is actually much better. So the eye button itself is not encased in this sort of waterproof casing. And so there may be sort of it appears as if there's a better agreement between our sensor and this eye button sensor. Again, I want to point out that the eye button sensor is $150, our sensor was $3. We also looked at comparing humidity measurements from our BME sensor to the humidity measurements from the eye button. And again, you can see we have relatively good agreement. One interesting thing to note in terms of the data itself is that you can see that the eye button can actually read temperatures over 100. And this is something that we'll come back to a little bit towards the end of the talk. So the EMU sensor cannot read over 100. It hits the 100 threshold, it can't go over. But the eye button can actually record values over 100. Then we also looked at a comparison between the two commercial sensors. So between the hobo temperature sensor and the eye button temperature sensor, which you can see here in panel D. And you can see that we have, again, a pretty close fit between the eye button temperature and hobo temperature, which ideally is what we would see. But again, we see some evidence of the hobo temperature, the hobo sensor seeming to read hot or read hotter. So this first part was just really looking at this first question, are they accurate? And it seems to us like we have good evidence to suggest that compared to commercially available sensors, our $3 sensor is doing quite well, at least in capturing temperature and humidity. So the next question was, do they actually detect fine scale variation? And so to do this, we fitted a statistical model where we wanted to account for the temporal variation and autocorrelation in the data over the course of the experiment. So in fact, we used, in particular, we used a GAM to fit the curves here. So you can see these lines here are fit by a generalized additive model, where we have two splines. We have one spline that's accounting for variation within day, so the within day variation, and then another one that's accounting for variation between days. And we also included an autoregressive autocorrelation term. And then we specifically used the transect as a fixed factor here. And so what you can see is that the splines themselves sort of capture the overall trend in the data pretty well, but there's a lot of uncaptured variation. So here you can see, and this is particularly true for the meadow transect, right? There's a lot of uncaptured variation or variation that's not being captured by our model here. Certainly at extreme high temperatures and extreme low temperatures. This is a little bit less true for the woods, although it is hot. It's a little bit hard to see, but there are blue points in these clouds of cloud of points above each one of these peaks. So it is happening in the woods, but it seems to be happening at a slightly lower level, suggesting in some way that maybe the forest sites are a little bit more stable, or there's some buffering going on. So just quickly to summarize this, in terms of the results that we had, so comparing the woods and meadow sites, we found that the woods were on average about 2 degrees cooler. And this may not necessarily sound like too much, but it's important to bear in mind that these sites were only 80 meters apart, and a 2 degrees Celsius difference is equivalent to a nearly 300-kilometer latitudinal variation in mean temperature, especially, well, at least for the eastern United States. So the wood site was more humid, and of course, as we would have expected, we found more light in the meadow site than we did in our wood site. So just to return to these questions, comparing our EMUs to the commercially available sensors, yes, we think we have evidence to suggest that they are accurate. And do they capture fine scale spatial and temporal patterns? At least in the sort of very simplified field experiment that we set up, the answer to that appears to be yes. I'm going to hand back over to James, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the other applications.
Yeah, so we've got some great questions in the chat, and we can talk more about those. But yes, it's very interesting what people's response and reactions are to these things. So Tim has talked a little bit about how we were using these out in the woods to measure microenvironment. And in that use case, we didn't even take advantage of the Wi-Fi because we didn't have a Wi-Fi network out there, out in the middle of nowhere in the woods. But there are lots of other applications that we've thought of. And
James, we're seeing your notes, not the actual slide presentation.
Oh, well, no worries. I haven't actually done anything. How's that? Good?
Gotcha.
Okay. Yeah. So we have actually kind of explored some of these other uses. And so our greenhouse manager at UConn was very interested to learn what the differences in light were for his greenhouses. And so we put an EMU in each of his greenhouses and one outside, and we compared the amount of light that each greenhouse got in a clear day. And so the blue curve here is what the outdoor conditions are. And then each of the other colored curves represents a different greenhouse. And so we've got a lot of differences across these greenhouses in terms of how much light they're getting, but also when they're getting it during the day. So that was kind of helpful for him to understand how things were working. Because these have wireless, it's relatively easy to set up wireless sensor networks. And we've kind of explored doing this for South Africa, for example. You could have like a base station that's hooked up to a cellular network and then a bunch of other EMUs that kind of communicate to each other as a daisy chain across the landscape. And there are some other people who are kind of working on this as well. So some researchers in New York are working with a power company to do just that sort of thing, where they have an EMU on every, or a sensor on every light pole that can kind of communicate to each other. Obviously, scientific research is a really great use case because many research projects require a very specialized sensor setup. So we had a friend, for example, who is working with pressure chambers and wanted to measure pressure in these chambers and have it, either turn something off or notify him when the pressure went out of range. And so we built something for him for that. Precision agriculture is interested in this because you want to maximize your yield for a crop, and you might want to change the amount of irrigation that each individual field or part of a field is receiving. So that's kind of quite useful. These are kind of really nice for schools because they're cheap and they're easy to collect a bunch of data and look at some things like that. But also it's a very good learning experience for students to learn to program. In fact, I believe in the UK, every 5th grader got a BBC Microbit microcontroller a couple of years ago. And I think that program is still going. And so the BBC Microbit is a very similar sort of microcontroller that you can hook up some LEDs or a speaker to and kind of program it to do things. So it's quite nice, and it's really great to see kids working with this sort of thing. And they're also useful in homes. So I use some smart outlets that I've programmed myself, where the EMU part is just basically turning on and off a relay to act as a switch. And the Wi-Fi really sort of helps, because with Wi-Fi you can now connect to the internet. And there's a smartphone app called Blink that just exposes an API, and you basically just send data to a website and it shows up on your phone. And so this is a picture of a weather station that I built at home that was sending data to my phone. And with that, you can also set up alerts or emails or things like that that can trigger based on a certain variable. There's also a website called ThingSpeak that's produced by MATLAB. And they have a web API as well. And so you can send data to them and it graphs it, and also exposes all that data to both MATLAB code. And so you can run code based on this data and do things. And another API website called IFTTT, or If This Then That. And If This Then That lets you take an input from something like ThingSpeak as an API call, and then trigger a bunch of other API calls from all kinds of different websites across the web. So, you can post to Twitter, you can post to Facebook, you can have it email you, you can say something in your Slack channel, whatever you want. And so we really have just scratched the surface of this. This ThingSpeak graph that I have is from last week, I believe, into this week from my greenhouse. So I have a greenhouse at home, and I've got an EMU set up there that's close enough that it can get my Wi-Fi network. And so it just sends data to me, and I can check what the temperature is, which is quite nice. We've sort of talked a little bit about temperature and humidity and soil moisture and light, but there's lots of other sensors that can be hooked up to these things, which is great. And it's why this modularity is so important. And one of the types is any sensor that's analog that just sort of puts out a voltage. We can measure that voltage, and using an analog to digital converter, which is what this big blue module is, we can convert that voltage to a number, make it digital. And so this particular one converts it to a 16-bit number. So 1 bit is the sign, and then 15 bits gives you 32,000 levels. So that's a tremendous amount of precision to work with, or resolution, when you've got some sensor. And so that's what we use for our soil moisture sensors, which are here on the left. You can also use it with a leaf wetness sensor. Same sensor can measure water level in, say, like a bucket or something like that. And you can use it with another type of analog sensor that is strain gauges or scales, like something to weigh something. In this case, we've got a strain gauge that is measuring tree growth. And so that can be hooked up to one of these analog to digital converters. You can even do sound. So we had our group of undergrads, and we asked them what they wanted to do with these EMUs. And they said, well, make it flash lights to music. And so we just hooked up a speaker, a little microphone, to an analog to digital converter and put some LEDs that the EMU controlled, and we were able to do that, and they really enjoyed it. So that was cool. There's other types of sensors as well that are already digital, so they already give you a number that means something. We've got these ultrasonic distance sensors that a different researcher that we cite in our paper is using to measure snow cover. And so it just measures the distance to the ground, and as snow piles up, then you get a smaller distance and it can measure that. I worked on another project using these infrared motion sensors to trigger a camera trap for hummingbirds, which are really small animals, and so normal camera traps don't work for them. And in this case, we used the motion sensor to figure out when the bird was there, but then we also triggered a car door lock actuator to just manually push the shutter button of the camera. And so, of course, all of these sorts of use cases, not only can they receive inputs, but they can put out outputs as well. They can turn on a switch or open a valve, run a solenoid, that sort of thing. And another researcher that we cite is using Arduino-based systems to measure water flow in caves in Mexico. And so they have an accelerometer inside a tube of PVC that's sealed, and it's set up like a pendulum. And so as the water comes into the cave, the pendulum swings, and they can measure that amount of swing and turn it into data. Someone else is working on something similar where you can hook up a sensor and measure tree swaying. And so there's tons of different applications that you can come up with different sensors. In fact, especially relevant now, but also before, we were looking into CO2 sensors for global change ecology. But now it turns out that CO2 is a nice proxy for building ventilation. And you can use that to assess COVID risk. If you know the size of the building and you know the number of people in there, you can measure CO2 and figure out how well your air is circulating. And so this is a nice little CO2 sensor that's $20. And so it would not be difficult to hook up something like that to an EMU and measure CO2. So we do have some things that are discussion questions that we don't necessarily have an answer to, but we're curious to hear what you guys have to say about these things. So I think Tim's going to start with this, but we'll just sort of go back and forth. And Tim, I'll keep sharing and change slides as you need. I think it's only a couple.
Yeah, that sounds great. So, one of the things that came up as we were working on this is, well, what kind of shielding should we be using for our temperature sensors? Because any kind of shield that you use, or even a lack of a shield, could potentially introduce a bias. And again, this comes back to what we saw with the hobo temperature sensor, which, you're sort of trading off the fact that that sort of sensor unit is completely waterproof, with the fact that actually it can lead to you getting inaccurate measurements of temperature if the air inside it heats up and then takes a while to cool down. In a similar way, if you had no shielding for your temperature, for your sensor unit, you run the risk of the actual sensor itself heating up, and the different properties of the sensor unit itself may heat up at different rates. And so depending on the angle at which you place it in the environment, how close it is to how much direct sun it's going to receive, all these sorts of things could affect the temperature measurements that you get. It seems like more and more the industry is moving towards sort of vane shields. So here you can see right in the middle, you can see these stacked upside down cones. So these are very commonly used temperature shields. But again, even you can get air trapped or cooling inside there that may heat up and sort of cause the sort of lag effect in the temperature. Another potential solution to that some people are proposing is that you actually hook up a fan that, like a computer fan, a small computer fan that will blow air, actually actively blow air into the vane or the protection casing where you have your temperature sensor unit. So that would activate a few seconds before you take your reading. Then you would take your reading, and then that would you would cycle through having to activate that. But of course, those types of setups increase the cost of anything that you're trying to do. Also increase the cost in terms of the power usage, right? If you're trying to put this out in the field and you're trying to make sure that you're running your sensor units, but then you also have to hook up a computer fan or something like that, that's going to increase your power draw. What you can actually see in this image that James has put up here is we actually tried out a whole bunch of different configurations of of different types of sensor hats, as we call them. We even made some different configurations using political sign board. This was kind of nice because it actually has sort of a layer of air in between these thin pieces of plastic. And then we covered them in aluminum foil tape to sort of make it a little bit more reflective. And one of the real challenges that we got to with the temperature is that there's no real gold standard. This kind of comes back to the skepticism that people had about our sensor units, right? Is that, well, how can this $3 thing be as good as this $50 or $60 thing? And so people were like, oh, you need some sort of independent measure of temperature. But really, what is the independent measures of temperatures? We can do pretty well. We can measure freezing point of water or boiling point of water. But between those two endpoints, how do we actually measure what is going to give us an accurate measure of temperature? This is in contrast, for example, to something like humidity, where the gold standard can be, we can actually sort of get different measures of humidity because we have different salt solutions or different salts that saturate solutions at different humidities. And so if we put our sensors over different solution types, we can get more, we can sort of see how well or how accurately they measure humidity. But really temperature is a real challenge because of that sort of the lack of a gold standard that's going to allow you to account for any potential non-linearity in changes in temperature. And light, I think light also has this very similar problem, right? Like, what is the gold standard for measuring light levels? Whereas again, we may have some sort of industry standards, but there's no clear gold standard for measuring light. Okay, James,
All right,
do you want to?
so we also have issues with missing and bad data, and I think Scott will appreciate these things in particular. So this is live data from last summer for humidity from one of our sensors. And it sort of highlights some common problems that we see with humidity sensors in particular, but also some of the other ones as well. So at the beginning here, we've got good data. And generally what pattern you see in humidity is that humidity goes down during the day, relative humidity, and then it hits 100% during the night. As the air cools, it hits 100% of its water carrying capacity. It can even oversaturate for some period of time. And so numbers above 100% are possible. And that's when the air is super saturated and you have water condensing out of it. And eventually that becomes, goes back to equilibrium at 100%. So this is what data should look like. But then it sort of gets weird in about June 15th or so. And probably what happened here is that we had a rain event and the sensor got wet. Then the sensor failed. And so we have some missing data here. And then eventually the sensor dried out again and started working. But when it started working again, it was biased to read high. And over the next couple of days, that bias sort of decreased a little bit. And so why is this? Well, so every humidity sensor I've ever seen has to be open to the outside air to do the sensing. So they all have a little tiny hole. In some cases, you can kind of put a membrane over that hole to try and protect it, but every single humidity sensor has to be open to the outside air to do a good job. So we have this trade-off between waterproofing versus accuracy. If you enclosed it like what we saw the hobo pendant doing with temperature, then you're going to get readings that are off anyway. But if you opened it to the outside air, then it's vulnerable. And so I don't know of a way around this trade-off. And so what it means is that rain can temporarily knock out these sensors. And the other issue is that humidity sensors, and I believe all humidity sensors sort of suffer from this, at least digital ones, have a tendency to get saturated. So if you take a humidity sensor up to 100% humidity and you keep it there for a while, then it will read high for some period of time. And so we don't know what that period of time is. It might depend on how long they've been saturated at 100%. And it might vary between sensors, even of the same brand. And so it's quite complicated because your accuracy and precision can vary over time and across the range of a sensor. And so to give you an example here, this is accuracy versus relative humidity and accuracy versus temperature for a different sensor. This is a Texas Instruments sensor. And so accuracy is best in sort of the ranges that we're most likely to measure. That's the way these sensors are calibrated. And so for relative humidity, that's between 20 and 60%. But outside of that range, accuracy tends to decrease. And for temperature, it's something that's generally calibrated to 25 Celsius, but really outside of that range, you sort of see these issues again. And so that's accuracy, but we also see similar things with precision. You saw the data that Tim showed you from the field where you had more scatter in the points as you got higher in temperature, for example. And so this is not really generally accounted for in global climate models when interpolating across grid cells. And they're not accounting for this measurement uncertainty. And sometimes these curves aren't even known. So for example, we don't have curves like this for accuracy or precision for the BME 280 from Bosch that we're using. And we know from sort of anecdotal experience that that can vary between sensors. Individual sensors of the same type. So we can have one sensor that just is not as precise as another at high levels of humidity, but another one that does better. And so we haven't really done a good job of accounting for this. And I would argue that really nobody else is either. But it can end up being a huge, huge source of error. And as Tim mentioned, 2 degrees Celsius of difference in temperature can equate to 300 kilometers of latitude variation. And so when we use this to do global change ecology, it's very hard to understand how that could affect things, but it almost certainly is. So we're curious to hear what you guys have to say about these issues that we've puzzled over for a lot of time. So I think that's it. We've got our acknowledgement slide here and be happy to take some questions.
I see we did have some questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that, so before we start going through the questions, firstly, thank you for your talk. If you want to ask a question, typically we ask the audience to put a hand up. So you just need to go to participants menu, and then you should have a option on the right that says raise hand. I'll go through those and then select you to ask your question. But I'll also read out any questions in the chats if you prefer not to ask them yourself. But yeah, if there are any questions in the chat you saw, do you want to go ahead with those first?
Well, James, at least one of the ones that I wanted James to chime in on is the power draw. Someone asked about like how efficient are they in terms of power usage. I did mention in my response that one of the tricks we used in order to sort of save power was we were able to turn them off between measurements. So we essentially had a clock that that continually ran, turn off the unit, and then we could wake up the unit using this clock.
Yeah, I think I have one of these. So this is a real-time clock, and it has its own battery, a little coin cell. And so this keeps really accurate time, which is nice for just keeping track of when you measure things. But it also has an output pin that can turn things on with an alarm, and it uses its own battery for that. And so we use that output pin to turn everything else on. And then we just disable the alarm and we're done. So that saves a tremendous amount because they're only on for about 5 seconds every time they log. And for those 5 seconds, I think they need about 20 milliamps, something like that. It's still pretty small. So 4 AA batteries in theory could last several years. But in fact, batteries don't tend to last that long because they eventually start leaking.
This also comes to another question that we had was about deploying them in extreme environments.
Yeah, what was the question?
So have they actually been tested much in extreme environments? I would say from what we've seen, the answer is not really.
Yeah, we haven't tried desert use or too much over winter. We've run them at about -20°C. It's about as cold as we can get them in Connecticut. Probably the issue there is going to be batteries before the EMUs have issues. So not terribly worried with that. Desert use is a little bit more of an issue. So if they get really hot, that can cause problems.
Yeah, it
The
seems like the
range of
sensors themselves,
temperatures-
the sensors themselves would be okay. It's more just like
Right.
whether the batteries or
Right.
the units we use would.
I think in both cases, probably the batteries are the weak link. And so there's probably options that you could use that could enable that. The sensors themselves are usually good from like -40 Fahrenheit to about, well, actually it's probably -40 to 85 C is generally the range for most of these parts. So there's a tremendous range.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? I was just wondering, do you also do anything to stop them being stolen or lost? So that was my question. The one about environments.
We actually yeah, that's a good question, because we had some people that were worried about this. James, I don't know if you have a picture. I'm not going to have a picture on this laptop. One of the things that we did as a kind of deterrent, because again, we were putting them quite close to a trail where people would often be walking around, and so we were like, well, what happens if someone takes one of ours? So one of the things we did, another thing I should mention is we're just using $2 Tupperware containers, right? Where our containers for these. We sort of pursued going down the route of getting containers engineered for us or 3D printed, and the engineers were like, don't bother, a Tupperware container with a gasket works great. So we were using these sort of simple Tupperware containers. They had a clear plastic lid, and so all we did was we stuck a notice to this clear plastic Tupperware lid that was maybe a little bit of a lie. We said, danger, high voltage, don't touch this thing. I wish we had a picture right now. We may not, but so we did that, and one of the other things we did was when we were in the field, if we saw people, we would say hello to them and we'd explain to them what we were doing. And I think just that kind of engagement is really useful. From field experience that I have with people in doing this kind of stuff in South Africa as well, like a similar kind of thing, right? You sort of, sometimes things are just going to disappear, and you have to sort of build in that redundancy if you can. The nice thing with our sensor units is that they're so cheap, you could probably afford to do that. But informing the public, I think, is one way to try and prevent that. So yeah.
Yeah, so at my postdoc, we had 64 of these outside for pretty much from May to October or later for 3 years. And yeah, we put the danger high voltage, and we also put a phone number on there. And we actually got quite a few calls that range from concern, why is this high voltage thing out here, to just curiosity, like what in the world is this Tupperware container, and what research are you doing in my woods? We have lost one so far out of many months with a lot of these out in the field. And it's unclear whether that was lost due to humans or animals. So animals can get quite interested in these too, and they can really tear these things up. As
we had some, James in that same experiment had some issues with the soil temperature probe. So we had these probes measuring soil temperature, and for some reason, animals love to chew through those wires in particular. Don't know why.
It's true of the hobos as well. So, everybody has this issue.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That's really fascinating talk.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to call on Adolphus. You've got your hand up. Do you have a question to ask?
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. So, but first of all, thank you so much, Dr. James and Dr. Moore. It's a very interesting work that you just did. I can't believe, that it all started off as a side project, because it really is hard to believe. And yeah, but basically on my side, I have two questions. So two very small questions. The first of which is with regards to, I think in one of your slides, you actually had the data on relative humidity. Now, I believe the reference that you used was based on the humidity data that you got from one of the nights. Is that correct? That the base reference of the humidity was taken at night.
We measured across nights.
Across nights. Okay, so was it like this base? Was it like taken on multiple nights and averaged or something?
You're talking about the comparison between the two field sites?
I'm not sure if it was a comparison between two field sites, because one data in which you showed the variation in the relative humidity, and I was just wondering, like this base humidity, that you're comparing relative to, like what?
I'm sharing.
I think it's in one of the last.
This is the slide you're talking about?
Yeah, this one, like this relative, is it what's the comparison? What is this comparison data like you're using for the, yeah.
So,
Oh, I
so
see.
relative humidity is not relative to another sensor. It's relative to the temperature of the air.
Yeah, it's relative to
The
temperature.
way humidity works is that it's you can have a certain amount of water in air at a certain temperature, and the colder the air gets, the less water can be in the air. And so
Right.
what relative humidity is measuring is relative to 100% saturation. In other words, as much water as the air can hold at that temperature, how much do we have? And so if we have 57% relative humidity, that means that 57% of the water that the air can hold at that temperature is present. And that's just how humidity is measured in every case, I think. Nobody measures absolute humidity.
Right, because earlier I think you made a remark saying that it might go beyond 100%.
Yes.
Correct.
And so that got me to the impression that was there a reference that you guys actually used? And if so, like how do you obtain that reference? Because if it overshoots, then we're basically saying that this is beyond the the capacity of the air to contain this amount of vapor and all that, which is a bit like when you first hear this, it doesn't sound like it's physically possible kind of thing.
Well, it's not in the long term, but it can exist in that state for a short period of time. Same with a salt solution. So you can actually supersaturate a salt solution to the point where you drop a crystal in and it just crystallizes like that.
Right.
Because it's out of equilibrium.
Right. Okay. In that case, then, right. That's a very good analogy there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And the same thing happens with supersaturated air. So if it's very still and not moving, then it can sort of stay that way a little bit longer.
Right.
And so you can imagine in that little sensor that has a tiny little hole that's allowing air into it in order to measure humidity. You can imagine that the conditions could arise where you're actually allowing that air to get supersaturated. So that's why you're getting those readings potentially why you're getting those readings over 100%.
Yeah,
right.
so that's this slide right here. These are readings over 100%. Except that there's these ones down in this tail that Tim was showing. And actually, those are where the EMU is reading quite a bit lower, but the I button is still saying it's saturated. And so that's actually this bias that we were talking about with the I button sensor, where it has gotten saturated to the point that it's now reading quite high when it shouldn't be.
Right.
And it takes time for that air to leave, and so you sort of have these kind of delays in terms of humidity staying reading high, even though really, at least compared to our sensor, which doesn't have that sort of similar, doesn't seem to have that problem as much. Our readings can start reading lower again, whereas that I button stays high for longer.
Our sensor actually has a heater built in that turns on for a few milliseconds to try and burn off any residual water in there. There's all kinds of things that people have tried to get around this issue. Understood.
Yeah, all right. My second question is with regards to so I believe your data seems to be pretty, like most data that you presented seem to be quite absolute in the sense that you do not have like any error bars or anything. I was just wondering, like is there any equipment or like software that could go together with the EMUs that could actually not only give you the data but also give you the margin of error that's associated with the readings and all that?
That would be great, but we would have to be able to figure out what that error looks like. And so going back to that slide I showed here, I'm gonna have to share my screen again, I guess. We could do something like that. Does that show?
Yeah, we can see the slide.
Okay. Yeah, we could do something like that if we had graphs like this. But we don't for most sensors. Yeah. And this is only accuracy. We don't have precision. Right. And so we could potentially get that data, but especially for something like temperature, it's actually quite hard because we don't have this gold standard. We don't have something that we can reference to see what our accuracy or precision is.
Yeah. So one thing that we could do to sort of allow to try and capture some of that error would be to have multiple sensors. I think someone mentioned this, so like have multiple temperature sensors at a single site. But even there, again, there is going to be some variation in accuracy and precision between the sensors. So you sort of have accuracy and precision differences between the individual sensors themselves. And then the fact that you're putting them in slightly different places, you're not having the sensors right on top of each other when you're taking your measurements. And so, I'm sure there are ways, and you guys are probably more experienced with this than we are, but like building in those types of errors is really important. But from a kind of ecological modeling perspective, no one's thinking about these things when they're thinking about temperature or environmental conditions. You sort of take it as a given that it's measured perfectly, right? Which clearly it's not.
Well, that could be a pause. Yeah, hopefully we can figure something out. That could be actually a good extension to this this thing. Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much once again for your insightful discussion. I think I really am quite liking the emus already.
Sure. Well, go check out the GitHub page. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much for professors.
So a couple questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Someone is asking about, when sensors are this cheap, shouldn't it be standard practice to always have 2 sensors in every project? And also, someone asks about calibration. And so we've sort of gone that route of trying to calibrate stuff and have multiple sensors, except that there's systematic errors that can be similar across all sensors. And the biggest one I'd say is that humidity oversaturation. So if it rains for a couple days, your humidity sensors, all of them are going to oversaturate and they're going to read high. And there just doesn't seem to be a good way around that unless you account for it post hoc with your data. So calibrating can only take you so far.
Yeah, I think that was most of the questions in the chat that came through. If you have any other questions, feel free just to unmute and ask them.
I'm curious about what Scott has to say about this issue of uncertainty in global climate data.
I'm very excited. So I do have some questions first. How long do these sensors last? I mean, I know it's batteries that'll go first, but how long will you could replace the batteries or hook it up through a, wire it, but how long do the sensors last, do you think?
I don't know that they really have a measurable lifespan in good conditions, at least. Like, a digital temperature and humidity sensor should last many years if it doesn't get wet.
So no moving parts, so it should last forever, essentially.
Right.
Yeah,
now,
exactly.
We do have issues with those humidity sensors. If they get wet too many times, they just crap out eventually.
Right.
After a year or two or something like that.
And can you tell that they're crapping out via their signals, what they return, or do you just sort of have to replace them like light bulbs? Replace them
they will sometimes just stop working.
Yeah, you'll sometimes just getting errors. This is one of the reasons why we have those LED error lights, right? So we could walk up to a sensor unit and tell if there was something strange going on.
Yeah, we use different colors for different types of errors or different problems with certain sensors.
Right, so it would flash purple or something if we were having a problem with the temperature sensor, for example.
Or flash blue twice, so we've done a bunch of things like that. The soil moisture sensors are another issue. We're using resistive sensors, which we found are more accurate than capacitive sensors. And so a resistive sensor has 2 posts that are metal that you stick in the ground, and it just measures the electrical resistance between the 2 of them.
Right.
Which changes as a function of the water. But it essentially acts as an electroplating rig. And so it removes metal from one side. And in theory, over a long period of time, you could remove enough metal to make a difference.
Right.
They do get a little bit of corrosion, but the corrosion amount changes the resistance so much less than the difference in resistance based on the amount of water. But it's a small error. But they potentially wear out, and they're so cheap, they're like 30 cents a piece. So we just
compared to the commercial ones, which are $150 just for the sensor itself, the soil moisture sensor itself. So
yeah, interestingly,
And they're essentially the same
Tim
thing. I
didn't
should
show
point out
this.
for those. Yeah.
We had this Hobo micro station, which is like a $500 logger, plus each sensor is about $200. So we borrowed this from someone. We didn't even show the data for this because we didn't think people would believe it.
No.
The Hobo was so incredibly terrible that it just wasn't even worth comparing. So we found that with the soil moisture sensors, they were actually reading negative soil moisture. And the light sensor was off by 50% or more regularly.
Yeah.
And this,
So,
you know, a $200 sensor.
yeah. So when are you guys? It's been a while since you first started this. When is the commercialization happening?
Never.
Why? Because you want people to make their own. I mean,
yeah, we had a lot of discussion about that actually.
Yeah, we talked with some patent people as well. The real answer is that there's no patentable application or part here. So it would be a
there is, but clearly there's a market for these sorts of things, and
yes, but we'd all rather do different things.
we're not salesmen either, so yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, Hewlett Packard started in his garage, or Hewlett, I guess, started in his garage. And for a while they were a real company. So I was really excited. Thanks for the long list of variables that you can measure. I mean, I'm really surprised and impressed. The tree swaying, that's quite amazing. That's how do you do the tree swaying measurement? Because that's something that buildings would use, right?
Well, you just hook up one of these sensors that has a gyroscope and well, you get them. They have a gyroscope, a compass,
accelerometer, yeah,
and an accelerometer all in the
Like
same.
what's the phone?
So you get 9 degrees of freedom in movement.
Okay.
Which you can do a lot with, and they're very, very accurate.
And they're very what?
Accurate.
So tell me about this. So you really had a lot of slides with a lot of data, but you never actually measured the reproducibility in a way that I might have expected. So, I mean, comparing the hobos versus your devices is one thing, but really what you want to see is your device against your device, and hobo against hobo, right? And reproduce and an instrumentation against itself in identical conditions at a different time, or from a different previous history, right? So coming from cold into, or coming from hot. So that reproducibility, of course, is what precision is, and you can measure that. But you need to do those experiments or take those measurements, I guess. So maybe it's off scope now, but that would be a characterization of the precision. Now, but you're also talking about signal versus noise, and it's hard to distinguish. Well, what did you mean when you said that? I think it was you, Tim.
Oh, I think, where was I talking about that? I believe that was when I was, go back to the talk.
Well, I guess the larger question is, James tells me that these sensors are essentially perfect in precision. But, well, that's what you told me when I first talked to you about this. I was very disappointed. But now I'm much more excited because there are at least missing values. So missing values is a source of uncertainty, but also the plus or minus bit, right? And that plus or minus bit includes, I guess it includes definitional uncertainty about, you know, exactly what humidity is. And it depends, I guess, on your ability to measure it better. So it depends on a better device, perhaps more expensive device, or a different way of measuring that's harder to, or typically harder to instrument. But I want to know the reproducibility, and I want to know the plus or minus style precision that you get, and of course the accuracy as well. And you don't have those measurements, you said.
Yeah, I think we've done that stuff. We just didn't present it because it's kind of uninteresting.
That's the most interesting part. What do you mean? My heart.
Well, okay, so if you find the data sheet for all these sensors, it'll give you the precision. You know, you'll get, you know, plus or minus 0.5 C or something.
From the manufacturer, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
but that's
Uh,
okay. But the specs are different from the actual, in-field usage.
right. So in field, they seem to be about that. And
Really?
we've done stuff where we put
Yeah.
two EMUs in the same spot and check them. And the other thing you can do is you can look at consecutive values.
Right.
Okay, so like 15 minutes apart or even 1 minute apart and see how much they differ. And they don't differ much. And it's kind of on par with the other sensors like the eye buttons too.
Right. Okay. So as far as you know, they're precise to infinitely many decimal places.
No, they're precise to what the manufacturer said,
Prescribed.
which is about as good as any other sensor.
Okay. I don't quite understand that, but I think this is very cool. And I mean, obviously it's the future, right? I want these for my house like now. Can you send me some? I need them now. Yeah.
I think the School of Environment actually has some Arduino kits. You could probably borrow it from them.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I really recommend these ESP8266 over Arduino. They're much more options to program them, and they're more powerful, and they're no more expensive.
That was the middle one, right? Or the third one, I guess, on the.
Yeah, so I can go back to that.
And they're from a Chinese
anybody who wants to
manufacturer?
play with these things. What do you think?
You said that was from a Chinese manufacturer?
Yes.
But the sensor itself is actually from. Oh, right. Yeah. Sorry. I was just going to say that the sensors themselves are often manufactured in the United States. The Chinese are just putting things together for you.
Oh.
How is it?
The middle ones are great. I mean, the ESP32, that has a dual core processor, so you can do two things at once.
That's mad.
Quite fast.
Yeah.
And
Right in Python.
4 megabytes of RAM means that nothing that you can dream up that these things can do generally runs into RAM limitations.
Right.
And they have Bluetooth. And like the ESP8266, you can program them in Python, which is much easier than C, I'd say.
Yeah.
We didn't have the benefit of Python when we started this, so all our stuff is in Lua, but I would like to convert to Python. I started doing some of that already.
Right.
Oh, I was going to say one of the things that we didn't actually mention was even just how we can pull the data off of these in the field. We did that using the Wi-Fi. So we pulled data off of these by essentially turning on the Wi-Fi, creating a switch where we could turn on Wi-Fi, and then if the Wi-Fi turned on, we would use another one that was connected to a laptop to actually pull the data off of them in the field.
Wow. So you didn't even have to touch it, really.
All we had to do was touch one wire. That was basically our switch. We would turn it on, turn it off, basically with a wire. And again, this is something that most commercial sensors, you don't really have that option, right? You've got to sort of plug in or something. So
we didn't
best case scenario, if you're using them in a place with cell phone reception though, and as long as you can daisy chain them to something that's connected to the cellular network, like James mentioned, you would just get your data texted to you.
Right. Well, we have this project with Brazil. You notice the dams, the earthen dams and mines still have been falling down. And the soil people want to go out there with a whole bunch of, resistive soil moisture measurement sensors. And I'm going, well, yeah, and they have I cannot tell you how big the budget is for that. So we may be calling you anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've discussed is our resistive soil measures are only about this long, right? The length of a pen or maybe shorter. So how do you actually measure deeper down? Essentially you could just take any two pieces of metal and stick them in the ground to measure soil moisture.
Right.
Or you could bury the little thing further down underground.
Oh yeah, one of the things we thought was you just bury them sequentially sort of down in a profile.
Well, I would hesitate to, dig too deeply in an earthen dam.
Right.
Especially one that was built as an afterthought and has no controls on it, whatever. Well, thanks very much, guys. This is really very interesting. I enjoyed it a lot.
Great.
I have some students who are working on, well, they're all outfitting self-driving cars because that's the only thing young engineers talk about nowadays. They'll be very interested in the sensor, in the motherboard or the breadboard thing, and the way you control the combinations. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's it for questions. But as I said, you've put the link in the chat for the GitHub, and we'll tweet it out as well. So
Can you save the group chat, or will that come in the recording?
yeah, no, I'll come in recording. We'll get a group chat.
Okay.
Okay, right.
Well,
Yeah,
thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for getting up, James.
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. That's going to conclude our meeting, and recording will end now.